G'day everyone, Artist Wayne here and welcome back to the build that is slowly teaching me just how much sanding one human being can survive. In the last episode, I discovered two very important things. Number one, this Ford GT40 Mk1 model looks absolutely incredible. And number two, hardly anything fits together properly. So in this episode, there will be more cutting, more sanding, more problem solving, and probably a little bit more destruction. But slowly, this model is starting to look like a real Ford GT40. So let's stop talking about it and get stuck into it.
It was finally time to start getting the body panels of my Ford GT40 Mk1 into shape. And honestly, the print quality really wasn't too bad at all. Now sure, there were still a few imperfections here and there, but compared to some of the prints I've dealt with in the past, this was actually pretty good. So thankfully, it was only going to need a light coat of wood putty, which was fantastic, because trust me, the less sanding I have to do on this thing, the happier I'm going to be. Once all the body panels were covered in wood putty, the next step was pretty obvious, a lot of sanding. But after that, I really wanted to focus my attention on the centre section of the Ford GT40 Mk1 and finally start getting some paint onto this thing. The plan was to prime it first and then lay down that iconic Golf Racing blue. And honestly, I had my fingers crossed that the colour I picked was going to be a close match to the real thing. The great thing about using wood putty is just how easy it is to sand, which, when you've got this much bodywork to get through, is definitely a good thing. But because it's such a soft material, you've got to make sure you seal everything properly afterwards. So once the sanding was done, the plan was to give everything a really good coat of enamel primer. That way it seals the whole surface up, hardens everything off, and gives me a nice solid base ready for colour. One major problem I quickly realised I was going to have was the decals. Now, because this Ford GT40 Mk1 is 1/8 scale, it's huge, and unfortunately there's really no off-the-shelf decal kits available for something this size. So that meant I was going to have to make my own, which is why I put an order in for some water slide decal paper. As I laid down my first coat of primer, I began planning out all the graphics. But then came another problem. Which year livery do I go with? Because there are a few different versions of the Golf Racing colours, and honestly, making that decision wasn't going to be easy. Decisions. Now this particular Ford GT40 Mk1 chassis actually won Le Mans in both 1968 and 1969, but the graphics and livery details changed between each year, so before my water slide decal paper arrived, I was going to need to make a decision. Which version was this thing going to become? I was now starting to print some of the smaller detail parts for the GT40's engine bay, and funnily enough, some of those files actually came from my Mad Max Interceptor build. Things like the radiator and the battery worked perfectly for what I needed here. But a lot of the other details were going to have to be made from scratch. Things like the fuel cap, the dash grille, and all of the lighting components. Those were all going to need to be modelled up in 3D Studio Max, which meant there was still a lot more work ahead. There's just something special about model making that never really leaves you. A lot of us started out as kids sitting at the kitchen table building plastic model kits straight out of the box, and back then the idea of being able to create your own models at any scale you wanted, customise every little detail and literally bring your ideas to life, well, who would have thought? Although I was definitely doing a little more cutting than I originally planned, because believe it or not, even the wheels didn't fit properly. So once again, out came the rotary tool and more plastic started disappearing. It was now time to start working on the seats, because surprise, surprise, they didn't quite fit properly either. So out came the heat, and with a little persuasion, I started reshaping them until everything finally sat where it was supposed to. And while all that was going on, I was also printing up the racing harnesses, because it's all these little details that really start bringing a build like this to life. I also decided to hand paint the silver sections on the wheel rims, because honestly, trying to mask up the inside of these wheels looked like an absolute nightmare. Now, whether or not it was actually going to look any good, well, only time would tell. But there was another big decision I still needed to make. Was this the Le Mans winning Ford GT40 Mk1 going to be shiny and pristine? Or was it going to look like it had just survived 24 brutal hours at Le Mans? And honestly, that decision was going to change everything. While I was waiting for everything to dry, I decided to shift my attention over to the engine bay, because once I started painting the stripes across the roof, the rest of the body was going to need to be completely masked up. So it made sense to get as many of the smaller details painted now as I could, before things started getting complicated. And honestly, this is the sort of stuff I really enjoy, all the little details that slowly start transforming a pile of plastic parts into something that actually feels real. Roof is now masked up for the orange stripe. Let's hope I don't pull any of that blue paint off when I remove the tape. Removing masking tape from a model after hours and hours of work always comes with a little bit of dread, because if that tape pulls up paint that hasn't bounded properly, it can be absolutely devastating. Especially after all the sanding, all the prep work, and all the time you've already invested into it. So this was definitely one of those moments where I was holding my breath a little. Thankfully, everything was coming together really nicely. The paint had bonded properly, the masking lines were nice and clean, and for once, there were absolutely no problems at all, which on a build like this felt like a pretty big win. It was now time to start getting the rear section of the Ford ready. Before I tackled one of the details I'd been looking forward to the most, the pinstriping.
Trying to get the pinstripe on, I thought I'd be smart and use a texter. Permanent marker does not work at all. However, I'm just painting it with a brush. Should work a treat.
Pinstriping seems like a small detail, but on a car like this, it makes a huge difference. Once those stripes start going on, this thing really starts looking like a proper Golf GT40. I was now back working on the rear body section of the Ford GT40 Mk1, getting it ready for another layer of wood putty, because even though the print quality on this model was pretty decent, there was still plenty of little imperfections that needed sorting out. First though, I needed to replace a small section that hadn't printed properly. This turned out to be a pretty easy fix. Remember, this particular part had actually been printed twice already, so instead of printing it all over again, I simply scavenged the piece I needed from the original failed print. And honestly, this is exactly why I keep everything, because you never know when an old failed print might suddenly become useful again. This rear section and the two doors were now the only major body pieces left to finish, and once they were done, the entire body of my Ford GT40 Mk1 would finally be complete. And honestly, things were starting to get really exciting, because slowly but surely this build was finally starting to come together, as I continued forging ahead on all fronts. Now let's talk paint for a minute, because apart from the water-based acrylics I always use, with this build for the body I was actually using a mix of completely different paint brands. For the undercoat I was using White Knight squirts, the orange stripes and clear coat were Rust-Oleum, and the Golf Blue for the body was a water-based spray from Dulux. Now normally mixing different brands and paint types together is probably not the greatest idea, and honestly this was the first time I'd ever used so many different paints on the one build, so naturally, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it didn't take very long before I started noticing a slight reaction in the paint. It first showed up after I sprayed the clear coat over the orange sections of the GT40's wheel rims. Now at the time I honestly thought it was just a bit of overspray, but later on I would discover that definitely wasn't the case. I was now about to start masking up the front section of the Ford GT40 Mk1, and this was easily going to be the hardest part of the entire masking process, because with all these curves, all these angles, and all these body lines, everything needed to line up perfectly. And obviously, I really needed to get this right, because one wrong line and the whole look of the car would be thrown off. Getting masking tape to curve properly is definitely not the easiest thing in the world, especially on a car like the Ford GT40 Mk1, where pretty much everything is curved. Because if you try and force the tape too much, it starts bunching up, wrinkling, and doing all sorts of things you really don't want to do. So this was one of those jobs where patience was going to be very important. Time to spray some orange. I've got to say I was actually really impressed with the Dulux water-based spray paint. The colour went down beautifully, it covered really well, and overall it gave a fantastic finish. So I'll definitely be taking a much closer look at their colour range for future models, because finding a paint that sprays nicely and gives you the colour you're chasing is half the battle with model making. Because when it comes to paint jobs like this, everything really hinges on the final clear coat, and thankfully this Dulux Blue seemed like it was going to handle that process really well. The Rust-Oleum orange stripe on the other hand, well, that was going to be a very different story. My white water slide decal paper had finally arrived, which meant it was finally time to make a decision. Which Le Mans livery was this Ford GT40 Mk1 going to wear? And after a lot of careful consideration, I decided to go with the 1969 livery. Because not only was that race an absolute nail-biter, but personally, I just think it looked better. And honestly, once I made that decision, everything finally started feeling real. It was time to go and have a chat with AI, because I needed help designing a custom decal sheet for the printer. Now after measuring up my 1/8 scale Ford GT40 Mk1, I fed all the dimensions into the AI and waited to see what it could come up with. And honestly, the results were pretty impressive, especially after changing the print settings from portrait to landscape. That's why I was doing a test print first. I did still need to tweak a few things in Photoshop, just to fine tune some of the sizes, clean up a few details and make sure everything was going to fit properly, because when you're working at 1/8 scale, even the smallest mistakes become really obvious. But once all that was sorted, it was finally time to print the decals onto the water slide paper. And honestly, seeing all those classic golf racing graphics finally coming to life was a pretty cool moment. After sealing the decal sheet with a couple of coats of clear lacquer, the moment had finally arrived, because I was now about to try my custom-made decals for the very first time. And honestly, this felt like a real milestone moment. Unfortunately, things didn't exactly go the way I'd imagined. Almost straight away, I started noticing the colours beginning to bleed, and then things got even worse. When I tried dabbing the logo dry with a tissue, the decal decided it would rather stick to the tissue than stick to the car. Clearly, I was going to have to rethink this entire process. Now, I'd like to say that after all of that, I moved on to something a little easier, but I didn't.
Now this is tricky. Getting that pinstriping on, very difficult.
I eventually got there with the pinstriping, and honestly, it was definitely worth the effort. So while my decal sheet was drying, I shifted my attention back to the rear of the Ford GT40 Mk1. Because after the disaster with the first decal, I decided to give the sheet another 2 coats of clear lacquer. And this time, instead of using a tissue, the plan was to use a sponge to dry the decals. Would it work? Well, I'm very happy to say, yes it did. And let me tell you, that felt absolutely fantastic, because after all the trial and error, all the failed attempts, and all the problem solving, I'd finally managed to create my own custom decals. This was one of those moments where you suddenly realise the possibilities have just become a whole lot bigger, because now I wasn't limited to whatever decals I could find online anymore. This could open the floodgates for all kinds of future builds. More race cars, Australian muscle cars in full race trim, imagine that. And honestly, that's what makes this hobby so exciting. Once you learn one new skill, it opens the door to 100 more.
Well, I have to say, seeing this thing finally wearing its proper golf racing colours is a pretty awesome moment. And sure, I have a lot more work ahead of me, more bodywork, more details, and a lot more challenges, because apparently this build enjoys fighting me every step of the way. But honestly, my Ford GT40 is really starting to come alive, and getting those custom decals working has taken this build to a whole new level. So I hope you've enjoyed episode 2 of my 1/8 scale Ford GT40 Mk1 3D build. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you all in the next one. I'm artist Wayne Dowsett, and thanks for watching, everyone.